You were never really part of this family anyway. Ask your mother why. My father said that to me at Christmas dinner. 18 people at the table. My 7-year-old daughter sitting exactly 4 chairs away. The carving knife was still buried in the ham. Mom dropped her fork. It wasn't dramatic. It just slipped from her trembling fingers and clattered against the ceramic plate. That tiny sharp sound was louder than anything my dad had ever said to me, because it confirmed a ghost I didn't even know needed confirming. But here's what no one expected. Grandma Rose, 84 years old, barely 5'2", and suffering from arthritis that made her wince on rainy days, stood up from the far end of the table. She reached into the worn tan leather handbag she's carried since 19. She pulled out a faded yellowed envelope, and she said 8 words that ended 28 years of toxic lies. What was in that envelope dismantled my father's entire universe, and it changed everything. Not just for me. Before I go on, if you've ever had to hold your tongue at a family table just to keep the peace, please take a moment to like and subscribe. Drop your location and local time in the comments. I'd love to know where you're listening from. My name is Wendy. I'm 34, and this is what happens when a family finally runs out of secrets and the scapegoat finally stops running. Let me take you back to the week before Christmas. The ticking clock on my father's ultimate betrayal had already started, though I couldn't hear it over the hospital monitors. My hands were still shaking. It was Tuesday, 4 a.m. at Mercy Hospital. I am the charge nurse in the intensive care unit. I had just spent 40 brutal minutes doing chest compressions on a patient in bed 3. You get used to the rhythmic, piercing beeps of the alarms. You get used to the sharp chemical smell of antiseptic that tries to cover up the scent of fear. But you never ever get used to the hollow silence when a code blue ends and you've lost the fight. I backed into the dim supply room, my blue scrubs clinging to my back, cold sweat dripping down my neck. I pressed the heels of my hands into my burning eyes. I just needed 30 seconds of total quiet. 30 seconds to remember how to breathe. Buzz. My phone vibrated violently against my hip. I pulled it out, my thumb smearing a drop of sweat across the cracked screen. Don't forget the holiday grocery run. Ham needs to be in the oven by 6 a.m. sharp on Christmas. Don't be late. Gary. My father. No, how is your shift going, Wendy? No, are you safe? Just a cold, flat order. I stared at the glowing blue letters in the dark room. A familiar heavy lump formed in my throat, choking off the air I had just been trying to catch. I shoved the phone deep into my pocket, locked my jaw, and pushed the heavy door open. Back to the floor. Back to the machines keeping people alive, while my own life felt like it was constantly flatlining. Fast forward to 8:30 a.m. The bitter South Carolina wind whipped dead brown leaves across the asphalt as I unbuckled my 7-year-old daughter Layla from her car seat. Layla let out a booming laugh, a sudden joyful sound like a storm door slamming in summer as a leaf caught in her dark curly hair. She has my sharp jawline and my stubborn streak. Her dad packed up his bags for Ohio 3 years ago to find himself. He sends a check sometimes, usually when the guilt gets too heavy to ignore. So it's just the two of us against the world, surviving in a cramped, drafty studio apartment 15 minutes away. We were standing in the deep, cold shadow of the Thompson house on Linden Avenue. It loomed over us, a massive 2-story brick fortress with a wraparound porch and a giant oak tree my Grandpa Howard planted back in 19. He and Grandma Rose bought it with cold hard cash from his GI Bill. I hauled Layla's heavy school backpack up the wooden porch steps. They creaked loudly under my boots, a sharp, splintering sound I'd known since I was a little girl. Inside, the house smelled of old wood polish, dust, and brewing coffee. My older brother Trevor was sprawled on the living room sofa, the television muttering quietly in the background. 31 years old, occupying the massive master suite upstairs, and he'd never paid a single dime of rent in his life. He didn't even look up from his phone as we walked in. Every night I worked a grueling hospital shift. I brought Layla here. Grandma Rose would put her in the guest bed, reading to her from the exact same worn 1970s school primers she used when she taught 3rd grade. Layla thought the stiff sentences, "See the dog run," were a comedy routine. Rose thought Layla was the brightest child in the state. They had a quiet, unspoken alliance. For me it was pure survival. It was a fragile, unspoken arrangement that kept a roof over my daughter's head. And Gary absolutely hated it. As I helped Layla out of her heavy purple coat, my father stepped into the hallway. He didn't greet his granddaughter. He didn't smile. He looked right past me, his dark eyes locking onto Trevor. "She drops that kid here like it's a free charity daycare," Gary muttered, his voice hard and carrying easily across the silent hallway. "But she's not even but." He stopped. He clamped his mouth shut right at the cliff edge. I froze, my cold fingers gripping Layla's zipper. I'd been hearing the ghost of that unfinished sentence my entire life, a dark, looming shadow hanging over my childhood. I never pushed him to finish it. I was an ICU nurse. I knew how to bandage things up to stop the bleeding. I didn't want to rip the wound open and see what was underneath. One night, about a year ago, the cracks had started to show. I was kneeling in that same dim hallway, frantically lacing up my sneakers to rush back to the hospital. Aunt Joyce, Gary's younger sister and a retired nurse herself, was wiping down the kitchen counter with aggressive, focused strokes. She often covered for Rose when her arthritis flared up too badly. Joyce didn't look at me as the sponge scrubbed against the checkerboard tile. The silence stretched out, tight and deeply uncomfortable. "You know your daddy's dead wrong about you, right?" she said softly. My hands stopped moving. The shoelace slipped from my numb fingers. I stared at her back, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I was utterly terrified of what she meant. But instead of asking, I just grabbed my keys. "Thanks for watching, Layla," I mumbled, practically bolting out the door into the freezing night. I chose not to know. I chose to desperately keep my fragile world spinning. I didn't know that Grandma Rose's cracked leather handbag held the very thing that was about to blow that world completely apart. 2 weeks before Christmas, the thin ice I had been walking on my entire life finally cracked. It started on a Tuesday morning. The sky over Camden was the color of bruised iron, heavy and threatening snow that would never come. I had just dropped Layla off at her kindergarten classroom. I could still feel the warmth of her quick hug around my neck when my phone rang. The caller ID flashed. Gary. My stomach instantly tightened into a hard knot. I answered on the second ring, my professional ICU voice kicking in automatically to mask my anxiety. "Hello. Come to the house," Gary said. His voice was flat, carrying that metallic, authoritative tone he loved to use. Now, he didn't ask if I had just worked 12 hours. He didn't ask if I needed to sleep. He hung up before I could reply. I drove to Linden Avenue in total silence. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. In my line of work, you learn to read the subtle signs before a patient crashes. A slight dip in blood pressure, a sudden shallowness in breathing. I knew the signs of my father's moods just as well. Something catastrophic was coming. The Thompson house felt different when I walked in. The usual smell of old wood and brewing coffee was suffocated by a heavy, unnatural stillness. The floorboards seemed to hold their breath. Diane, my mother, was nowhere to be seen, likely hiding in her bedroom to avoid whatever storm Gary was brewing. Trevor was supposedly at work, which meant his part-time mechanic gig where he casually clocked maybe 25 hours on a good week. I found Gary in the kitchen. He was sitting rigidly at the head of the long table, both hands wrapped around a mug of black coffee he wasn't drinking. The fluorescent light overhead buzzed, casting harsh, deeply lined shadows across his face. "Sit down," he barked. I sat. The cold from the worn linoleum chair seeped right through my jeans. Gary didn't look at me at first. He stared at the center of the table, his jaw muscles working. "Financial situations have changed around here," he began. He sounded like a bank manager denying a loan. "If you want to keep bringing Layla here at night and disrupting this household, you need to contribute more. The utilities are through the roof. Let me give you the cold, hard context. Grandma Rose was 84. Her eyesight was failing, and her joints were stiff. Because of this, Gary had eagerly appointed himself the financial manager of the house. Rose humored him. She let him collect money to pay the bills just to make him feel like the king of the castle. I didn't live there. I hadn't lived there since I was 21, yet I was already paying him $500 a month. He called it a household contribution. He claimed it covered the extra electricity, water, and breakfast cereal Layla consumed during her sleepovers. I never argued. I was exhausted, and fighting him was a luxury I couldn't afford. I just quietly transferred the money. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. "How much more?" Gary's dark eyes finally locked onto mine. They were completely devoid of warmth. 700. The number hit me right in the chest. I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. "Dad," I said, my voice tight and strained. "I already pay more than Trevor does. Trevor actually lives here. He has the biggest room in the house." Gary leaned forward, resting his heavy forearms on the table. He looked at me the way he always did, like I was a stray dog that had tracked dirty mud onto his pristine carpet. He didn't blink. "Trevor is family. That's different. Family." He wielded that word like a scalpel, making a precise, agonizing cut. It was a gated community, and he was proudly jingling the keys right in front of my face, letting me know I was locked out. "If you can't manage the $700, Wendy," he continued, his tone dropping into a soft, dangerous whisper, "I'll have to sit down and talk to Mama about the Layla situation. She's 84. Having a kid running around is just too much stress on her heart. We might have to stop the overnights." There it was, the trap snapping shut. It wasn't about guilt. It wasn't about the water bill. It was a calculated hostage situation. He was holding a gun to the single fragile thread keeping my life from completely unraveling. If you don't work in healthcare, you might not understand the sheer terror of what losing that house meant for me. Camden has one decent hospital. It has exactly 0 daycares open past 7 p.m. If Gary banned me from Grandma Rose's house, I couldn't work the night shift. I would be forced to switch to days. That meant a severe pay cut. It meant losing my shift differential. It meant I wouldn't be able to afford the rent on our drafty studio apartment. I would lose everything. He knew my exact vitals. He knew exactly where to press to make it hurt the most. I looked down at my hands. They were trembling. "Okay," I whispered, the word tasting like ash in my mouth. 700. Gary leaned back, a flicker of dark satisfaction crossing his face. "Have the check on the counter before your shift tonight." That evening, the house felt even colder. I stood in the living room, my tired eyes burning as I wrote out the check on the coffee table. The pen felt like it weighed 50 pounds. Heavy footsteps thumped down the oak staircase. Trevor strolled into the room. He wore a clean flannel shirt and smelled faintly of expensive cologne. He had heard the entire exchange that morning. I knew he had. He didn't make eye contact with me. He didn't ask how I was doing. He just sauntered into the kitchen, opened the fridge, grabbed a craft beer, and wandered out the back door toward the yard, completely oblivious to the fact that I was bleeding myself dry just to survive in his shadow. I tore the check from the ledger and left it on the counter. What I didn't know as I walked out the door that night, shivering in the December wind, was the devastating truth about that money. I wouldn't find out until much later. Gary had been lying to Diane and Grandma Rose. He told them I only contributed $300 a month. He had been quietly pocketing the rest of my hard-earned money for years, funneling it into his own hobbies while I counted pennies at the grocery store. Gary knew exactly what he was doing. He was backing me into a dark corner, starving me out of the picture. But he didn't realize that when you back a mother into a corner, she stops being afraid. She starts looking for a weapon. But the real catalyst, the spark that finally lit the fuse, was Morgan. 4 days before Christmas, the pieces of my father's quiet, ruthless puzzle began to snap together. I was driving home from a brutal day shift. The sky was already dark, and a biting frost was creeping across the edges of my windshield. I had to stop by the Linden Avenue house just to pick up Layla's heavy purple winter coat. She had left it on the hallway hook. I parked on the street. The house looked darker than usual. The massive oak tree branches scraped against the second-story windows like skeletal fingers. I turned the brass knob on the front door. It opened smoothly, the hinges completely silent. The downstairs was pitch black. No television hum, no smell of coffee, just a cold, empty stillness. I stepped inside, my boots silent on the runner rug. Then I heard it. Snap. The sharp metallic sound of a heavy tape measure retracting. It came from the second floor. In the ICU, your ears get trained to catch the exact pitch of an alarm from 3 rooms down. My head tilted up toward the dark staircase. I didn't call out. Instead, an old primal instinct took over. I crept up the first 3 wooden steps, keeping my weight on the edges where the wood didn't creak. My heart began a slow, heavy thud against my ribs. Voices drifted down the stairwell. It was Trevor, and Morgan, his usually quiet, softly smiling girlfriend. "This wall has to go," Morgan was saying. Her voice wasn't soft anymore. It was sharp, clipped, and demanding. "If we knock this down, we can expand the master closet by at least 4 feet. I was thinking a sage green for the walls. Very calming. I froze on the 4th step. The shadows of the banister fell across my face. "I don't know, babe," Trevor muttered. His voice was thick with unease. He sounded weak. "Grandma loves this room. It's where she keeps her sewing stuff. Her old photo albums are in there." Snap. The tape measure pulled out and retracted again, a harsh, violating sound. "Trevor, look at me," Morgan commanded. A heavy silence followed. "We are having a baby. I am not raising my child in a cramped single room while your grandmother hoards a whole floor. Your dad promised us this space. He said once the deed is fully in his name on Christmas, we're gutting this level. Rose can move down to the spare room by the kitchen. Or Wendy can finally take her." I stopped breathing. My hand locked around the wooden banister so hard the wood bit into my palm. A baby. My clinical brain instantly processed the diagnosis. The sudden demand for $700. The complaints about Layla's noise. The sudden push to make me feel entirely unwelcome. Gary wasn't just being cruel. He was clearing the space. He was bankrupting me to force me out. They were actively measuring the walls of my 84-year-old grandmother's house right over her head. They were preparing to steal her home while she sat downstairs. I didn't storm up the stairs. I didn't scream. A cold, terrifying clarity washed over me. I slowly backed down the steps, my eyes fixed on the dark landing above. I grabbed Layla's purple coat from the hook, slipped silently out the front door, and pulled it shut with a soft click. I drove back to my tiny apartment in a state of vibrating shock. My father was planning a heist, but there was one massive flaw in his plan: the house was never his to give away. 3 days before Christmas, the universe handed me the final piece of the puzzle. It was freezing. I was at the rundown strip mall on the edge of town, picking up a prescription for Layla's ear infection. The harsh, flickering neon lights of the storefronts buzzed in the cold air. As I pushed the heavy glass door of the pharmacy open, I glanced to my right. Right next to a payday loan center was a cheap, dimly lit office. Fast-track notary and legal forms. The door swung open. A man walked out, his head ducked down against the wind. It was Gary. He wasn't wearing his usual Sunday suit. He was in an old jacket, his shoulders hunched. He was clutching a stiff brown envelope tightly against his ribs. He looked paranoid. His eyes darted left and right across the empty parking lot. My nurse's training kicked in. Rapid movements, sweating despite the cold, defensive posture. The man was in full fight-or-flight mode. "Dad," I called out across the cracked pavement. Gary jolted. He spun around so fast he nearly dropped his keys. The color instantly drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly gray under the neon lights. A second later, the fear vanished, hardening into a thick mask of fury. "What are you doing spying on me?" he snapped, his voice rough. "Spying?" I held up the small white pharmacy bag. "I'm getting Layla's medicine. What are you doing at a strip mall notary?" He shoved the brown envelope deeper under his arm, angling his body away from me. "None of your damn business, Wendy. Just make sure the dinner is ready on time." He didn't wait for an answer. He practically jogged to his truck. The engine roared, and his tires screeched against the cold asphalt as he tore out onto the highway. I stood alone in the freezing parking lot, the wind biting through my jacket. Real lawyers pull property titles. Real lawyers sit in nice offices downtown and ask detailed questions. Gary hadn't gone to a lawyer. He had printed some fraudulent transfer papers off the internet and paid a shady strip mall notary $20 to stamp them. He was trying to steal a family estate with a piece of cheap printer paper. I should have called the police. I should have called him out right then and there. But I didn't. I watched his taillights disappear into the dark, and a slow, dangerous thought crept into my mind. Let him try. Christmas morning arrived like a heavy, suffocating blanket. I was awake at 6 a.m., surviving on 4 hours of broken, nightmare-filled sleep after a grueling ICU shift. My eyes felt like they were packed with crushed glass. Every muscle in my back ached, a deep, dull throb from lifting patients the night before. But the massive 20-pound holiday ham wouldn't score and glaze itself. I hauled Layla out of our freezing apartment. She was still wrapped in her pink fleece pajamas, clutching her stuffed bear. Her pressed blue velvet Christmas dress hung carefully in the back seat, swaying like a ghost in the rearview mirror, as I drove us through the dark, icy streets to Linden Avenue. By 7 a.m. I had the Thompson House oven blasting, the kitchen windows fogged up, trapping the heat and the sharp smell of cloves and brown sugar inside. I moved through that kitchen the same way I moved through the trauma ward, calculating, precise, completely shutting off the pain in my own body to keep the machine running. By 9 a.m. my knuckles were cramped and my skin was raw from peeling 10 pounds of cold russet potatoes. By 11 a.m. the sweet potato casserole was violently bubbling on the stove. Yeast rolls were rising under a damp flour sack towel, and gallons of fresh lemonade were steeping in the massive glass dispenser Rose had owned since 9. She didn't even wash her own hands. "Smells nice, Wendy," she murmured, not looking me in the eye. She spent exactly 20 minutes slowly placing folded paper napkins on the long wooden table out on the enclosed back patio. Exhausted by her monumental effort, she sighed, patted her perfect hair, and retreated to the living room to watch a holiday parade on TV. That was my mother's contribution to the family. Trevor and Morgan arrived at 1 p.m. The front door slammed shut, jarring my fried nerves. Trevor swaggered into the kitchen, his boots tracking melting snow onto the linoleum I had just swept. He proudly placed a single bottle of grocery store Merlot on the counter with a loud thunk. The yellow discount sticker was literally still slapped over the barcode. $12. My father walked into the kitchen right behind him. Gary's eyes bypassed me completely. He zeroed in on Trevor, a wide, proud smile splitting his face. He stepped forward and clapped Trevor heavily on the shoulder. "Now that's a man who knows how to provide for his family," Gary boomed. His voice bounced off the tile, loud and performative. "Takes care of his own." I stood frozen at the sink. I had 7 complex from-scratch dishes steaming on the countertops. I had been on my aching feet for 8 solid hours. I was paying the utility bills for the very oven baking their dinner. Nobody looked my way. Nobody said thank you. I bit the inside of my cheek so hard I tasted copper. I focused on Layla. Sweet, perceptive Layla stood on a wooden step stool beside me. She was quietly helping me fold the last of the napkins, meticulously tucking each corner exactly the way I had taught her. She looked up at me, her big brown eyes catching the tension in my jaw. She reached out and patted my flower-covered arm, a silent 7-year-old anchor keeping me from floating away. Then, the floorboards near the hallway creaked. Grandma Rose shuffled into the kitchen. Her breathing was shallow, and her knuckles were white as her hand gripped the doorframe for support. She stood perfectly still, watching Layla and me work. The kitchen was chaotic, but Rose seemed entirely detached from it, observing us like a general looking over a battlefield. She wore her best Sunday dress, and her cracked tan handbag was looped tightly over her forearm. She never brought her purse into the kitchen. Never. Rose slowly let go of the doorframe and shuffled toward me. The smell of old paper and peppermint followed her. She reached out, her frail, trembling hand resting gently on my tense shoulder. Her grip was surprisingly strong. She leaned in close to my ear. "You look exactly like your daddy when he was a good man, baby," she whispered. A sudden, freezing chill shot straight down my spine, fighting the heat of the oven. I stopped wiping the counter. I turned my head to look at her, expecting to see the cloudy confusion of dementia, but her pale blue eyes were crystal clear. They were sharp, focused, and terrifyingly calm. I forced a tight smile, thinking it was just nostalgic, holiday rambling. "Thanks, Grandma. Why don't you go sit down before the guests arrive?" She patted my shoulder once more, her thumb pressing firmly into my collarbone. "I'm sitting exactly where I need to be tonight, Wendy." She turned and shuffled out toward the back patio. I didn't realize it as I watched her walk away, but she wasn't just taking her seat for dinner, she was taking her position. And that cracked leather handbag was fully loaded. The air on the back patio was thick with the smell of roasted meat and heavy, expensive perfumes. By 6 p.m., all 18 people were squeezed around the massive wooden table. The patio heaters hummed a dull, low orange glow in the corners, fighting back the biting December chill seeping through the screens. It was a chaotic, loud scene. A chaotic scene my father had meticulously curated. The guest list wasn't intimate. It was a crowd. Family, longtime neighbors from Linden Avenue, and even a few elders from the local church Gary attended strictly for the networking. I took my seat near the far end, exhaustion humming in my veins. My eyes were hot and heavy. Gary sat at the absolute head of the table. He wasn't wearing his faded corduroy or his usual scuffed boots. He was dressed in a crisp, stiff, light blue button-down shirt that looked like it belonged behind a mahogany desk, not a carving station. His hair was slicked back. He looked terrifyingly confident. He looked like a CEO about to announce a massive round of layoffs while cashing a bonus check. And then I saw it. Tucked carefully under the right leg of his heavy oak chair was the thick brown envelope from the strip mall notary. Diane sat rigidly to his left, unusually quiet. She wasn't drinking her wine. She had reapplied her coral lipstick 3 times in the last hour. A nervous, frantic tic she only exhibited when she was genuinely terrified. Her eyes darted around the table, never landing on anyone for more than a second. Trevor sat across from her, his chest puffed out under his flannel shirt. He was loudly recounting a story about a truck engine he hadn't even finished fixing, dominating the conversation. Morgan was beside him, her hand resting subtly over her stomach, wearing a smug, victorious smile that made my stomach turn over. Aunt Joy sat firmly to my right, a quiet, solid presence. She passed the sweet potatoes without a word, her eyes sharply assessing the room. On my left was Layla, swinging her short legs under her blue velvet dress, humming a quiet off-key tune to herself, completely oblivious to the tension pulling the air tight. At the exact opposite end of the table from Gary sat Grandma Rose. It was the true matriarch's seat, but she looked tiny sitting there. She didn't speak to the neighbors. She didn't touch the water glass in front of her. Her tan handbag sat squarely on her lap, not on the floor, not hooked over the back of the chair. On her lap, her frail, spotted hands resting delicately on top of the cracked clasp. Halfway down the table, sitting next to Mrs. Marshall, was Reverend Clara Dawson. She was a sharp, perceptive woman in her late 60s who had known my Grandpa Howard for decades. Rose had insisted on inviting her. I thought it was just Southern hospitality, an old woman wanting her pastor near on the holidays. I didn't know Reverend Dawson was there to witness an execution. Reverend Dawson stood up slowly, tapping her water glass with a spoon. The loud chatter died down immediately. She delivered a beautiful grounding grace about gratitude and truth. Everyone bowed their heads. I kept my eyes open. My gaze slid down the table. Gary's eyes were open too. He was staring directly at me through the flickering candlelight. His gaze was cold, calculating, and utterly triumphant. It was the look of a man who had already won the war, and was just waiting to watch the enemy bleed out. The moment the choruses of Amen faded, before a single fork could pierce the massive steaming ham I had spent 8 hours cooking, Gary pushed his chair back violently. The wood screeched against the concrete patio. He stood up. "Before we dig into this wonderful bounty," he boomed, his voice deliberately projecting off the brick walls, "meant for the neighbors as much as for us, I have a major family announcement." The entire table went dead silent. The only sound was the low hum of the patio heaters. Well, that and Grandma Rose, who methodically picked up a butter knife and began slowly buttering her dinner roll. Gary straightened his posture, hooking his thumbs into his belt loops. He looked down the length of the table like a king surveying his peasants. "As the head of this household, I've made a final, necessary decision about the future of this property. Morgan and Trevor are expecting a baby." A flurry of polite gasps and sudden congratulations rippled through the neighbors. Trevor beamed, lifting his glass of cheap Merlot. Morgan patted her stomach, her smile sharpening. Gary held up a heavy hand to silence them. He wasn't finished. "Because of this tremendous blessing," Gary announced, his voice dropping an octave, heavy with self-importance, "Trevor is getting the house. I've had the legal transfer papers officially drawn up and notarized. The second floor will be gutted and renovated starting next week. The future of the Thompson legacy starts now." He delivered the news with flat, merciless finality. Trevor tried to look surprised, but his bad acting gave him away. He had clearly rehearsed his surprised face in the mirror. Morgan squeezed his hand, her eyes flashing toward me, sharp as a razor. Uncle Roy, Gary's older brother, stopped chewing his roll. His wife Laura shot a panicked sideways glance at me. Aunt Joyce slowly set her glass of lemonade down. The ice clinked loudly against the glass, a sharp crack in the suffocating silence. Gary kept going, deliberately twisting the knife. He wasn't just taking the house, he wanted the audience to applaud him for it. "This historic house needs to stay with family." He paused, letting the silence stretch until it was physically painful. He stared right at me. Real family. The temperature on the porch plummeted. I felt the air violently leave my lungs. I looked at my mother. Diane was aggressively shredding her paper napkin under the table into tiny snowy ribbons, staring a hole into her empty ceramic plate. She was hyperventilating silently. Mrs. Marshall, our neighbor of 35 years, cleared her throat, a wet, rough sound of profound discomfort. Reverend Dawson folded her arms, her posture going instantly rigid, her eyes darting between Gary and me. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. My hands, still cramping from peeling potatoes, gripped the rough edge of the wooden table so hard my knuckles turned white. I had spent my entire life swallowing his poison to keep the peace. I had let him take my money, my time, and my dignity. But I looked down at Layla, who was staring up at me, sensing the sudden terror in the air. "Dad?" I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the hum of the heaters like a scalpel. "What exactly do you mean by real family?" Gary turned his entire body toward me. He didn't flinch. He didn't lower his voice for the neighbors. He projected it even louder. He had been waiting for this moment for 34 years. "You know exactly what I mean, Wendy." 18 people stopped breathing. 18 people watched a father prepare to verbally annihilate his daughter on Christmas Day. I didn't look away. I didn't cry. My voice was eerily calm, driven by an adrenaline rush that felt exactly like slamming a crash cart into a dying patient's room. "No, Dad," I commanded softly. "Say it clearly. Use your words." I saw the flicker of raw, unfiltered rage spark behind his dark eyes. Gary's jaw tightened. A small vein pulsed at his temple. He had expected me to crumble. He had fully anticipated that I would grab my purse, burst into tears, and flee the patio, leaving the house and the victory entirely to him. For 34 years, my assigned role in this house was to absorb his anger, apologize for breathing his air, and shrink away. 34 years of conditioning told him I would fold under the weight of an audience. Not tonight. Tonight, the ICU nurse was clocking in. Gary sneered,
It was a genuinely ugly expression that twisted his face into something unrecognizable. The mask of the proud, wealthy patriarch slipped completely, revealing the cruel, petty man underneath. "You were never really part of this family anyway," he spat. He didn't look at me when he said it.
He rigidly extended a thick finger and pointed directly at Diane, who was shaking so violently her chair rattled.
"You want to know why? Ask your mother why."
3 agonizing seconds of absolute, terrifying silence followed. No wind rattled the screens. No cars passed on Linden Avenue, just the low, mechanical hum of the patio heaters burning gas. Clang! Diane's heavy silver fork hit her ceramic plate, bounced and clattered onto the wooden table. She didn't move to pick it up. She stared blankly at the metal tines, looking like she was about to vomit. Next to her, Mrs. Marshall gasped out loud, her hand flying to her chest. And then came the sound that finally broke the dam inside my chest. "Mommy?" I felt a violent tug on my sleeve. I looked down. Layla's bottom lip was quivering. Her massive brown eyes were welling up with thick, heavy tears that caught the candlelight. She wasn't looking at Gary. She was looking at me, her anchor, searching for a reason why the ground had suddenly dropped out from under us. "Mommy," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Are we not family? Did we do something bad?" 18 people stopped moving. 18 adults sat frozen in their chairs, watching a 7-year-old child beg to know why she was hated on Christmas Day. In the hospital, when a patient crashes, you have roughly 5 seconds to decide how you are going to handle the room. You can panic, or you can step up and take control. In that moment, staring at my daughter's tear-stained face, a terrifying, absolute clarity washed over me. The door to my childhood, the desperate hope that I could ever win this man's love, slammed shut forever. I was no longer the victim. I was the shield. I stood up. I didn't shout. I didn't throw my glass. My voice dropped into a low, dangerous hum that vibrated in my own chest. "You just said that in front of my daughter," I said, locking my eyes onto Gary's. "Whatever sick, twisted fantasy you have in your head, you do not get to do that to a child." I didn't wait for his response. I reached down, scooped Layla out of her chair, and walked her around the edge of the table to Aunt Joyce. I didn't even have to ask. Joyce didn't hesitate. Her face was a mask of cold fury directed at her brother. She reached out and wrapped her arms tightly around Layla, pressing the little girl's face deep into her shoulder to block out the sight and sound of the man at the head of the table. I walked back to my spot, but I didn't sit down. I planted my boots firmly on the concrete floor. My heart rate was steady. The fear was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, clinical focus. "You've been dropping poisonous, vague hints my entire life, Dad," I demanded, leaning slightly forward. "You deliberately brought an audience tonight. You wanted a stage. So perform, Gary. Say it all." Gary let out a dry, barking laugh, but it sounded hollow. He hated being challenged, especially in public. He looked at Reverend Dawson, expecting backup, expecting the pastor to tell me to respect my father. Dawson just stared back at him, her expression as hard and unforgiving as carved stone. "Fine," Gary spat. His face flushed a dark, angry red. He threw his hands wide, a grand, dramatic gesture. "I don't owe you a damn thing, Wendy, but I'll give you the truth. Your mother confessed it to me 31 years ago, right before Trevor was born. She had an affair." The word hung in the air like a bad smell. Uncle Roy let out a sharp breath. Gary pointed at me again, his finger trembling with adrenaline. "You are not my biological daughter. You are some other man's bastard blood. But look at me. I was a good Christian. I kept you. I fed you. I raised you when I should have thrown you out." He slammed his fist onto the table, making the silverware jump. "But this house, this property, this goes to Trevor. This goes to true Thompson blood, not you." Chaos erupted. It sounded like an emergency room on a Saturday night. Uncle Roy slammed his fist on the table, knocking over a water glass. "Gary, have you completely lost your mind?" he roared. Laura, his wife, covered her face with her hands, sobbing quietly. I looked at Diane. She was physically shrinking into her oversized cashmere sweater, trying to disappear. "Mom," I commanded, my voice cutting through the shouting. "Is it true? Am I not his?" Diane slowly looked up. Black mascara was running in thick streaks down her pale cheeks. She looked from Gary to Trevor, and finally to me. She looked exactly like a trapped animal caught in the headlights. I'm so sorry, Wendy," she whispered, her voice a pathetic, breathy squeak. "It's complicated. I made terrible mistakes." Gary slammed the table again in triumph, a wild, manic gleam in his eyes. See, she admits it. She confessed it to me in 1996. I've carried this burden for decades. Further down the table, Trevor dropped his fork. He looked absolutely bewildered. The smug confidence had completely melted off his face. Wait, he stammered, looking back and forth between Gary and Diane. So Wendy she isn't mine? She isn't our blood? Never was, son, Gary said proudly, puffing his chest out. That's exactly why you get the legacy. You are the only true heir. Reverend Dawson pushed her chair back and stood up. She was a tall woman, and when she drew herself up to her full height, she commanded the entire patio. Her voice boomed with heavy moral authority. Gary Thompson, this is an absolute abomination, she declared, her voice shaking with disgust. You are deliberately tearing a child's heart out at a Christmas dinner table. You have disgraced yourself. This is my house, Clara. Gary roared back, the veins in his neck bulging. He grabbed the brown envelope from under his chair and slammed it onto the table. My family, my property, my decision. And right there, as he screamed at a pastor over a glazed ham, the grand illusion shattered completely. My house, my family, my decision. He wasn't a strong leader. He was a pathetic, cruel dictator desperately trying to hold on to a crumbling, hollow country. He thought he had won. He thought the bleeding was over. But at the far end of the table, Grandma Rose was just putting on her gloves. In the ICU, there is a very specific kind of silence that falls over the room right before a patient's heart stops completely. The frantic alarms haven't kicked in yet. The doctors haven't started shouting orders. And for one terrifying second, everything just hangs suspended in the air. That exact silence fell over the back patio. At the far end of the long table, Grandma Rose slowly pushed her heavy ceramic plate forward. The porcelain scraped against the wood, a harsh, gritty sound that made Mrs. Marshall flinch. Rose placed both of her frail, spotted hands flat on the table. Then, with deliberate, agonizing slowness, she moved her right hand to the brass clasp of her tan leather handbag. Before she could open it, Aunt Joyce cut through the thick tension. Her voice wasn't raised. It was as calm and flat as a frozen lake. Gary, Joyce said, her eyes locked on her older brother. I have one quick question. Gary whipped his head toward her. He was panting slightly, high on the dark adrenaline of his own cruelty. What? He snapped, his chest heaving under his crisp blue shirt. Whose name is actually on the deed to this property? Gary rolled his dark eyes, letting out an arrogant, breathy scoff. What kind of stupid question is that, Joyce? It's the family estate. Dad left it to me to manage. I'm the head of this household. Joyce didn't blink. She tilted her head, giving him a look of absolute chilling pity. It was the way you look at a dog that doesn't realize it's walking into traffic.
Dad died in 2016, Gary. Did he leave a legally binding will transferring the title directly to your name?
Gary froze. His mouth hung open slightly. You could literally see the gears grinding to a violent halt behind his eyes. The arrogant flush drained from his cheeks.
It was universally understood, he stammered, his booming voice suddenly sounding very small.
Understood isn't a legal document, Gary. Mr. Marshall chimed in from the side. The older neighbor leaned forward, his voice dripping with pure disdain. That house is still entirely in Rose's name. You don't own a single brick of it. Every single head at the table snapped toward Grandma Rose. She was sitting perfectly still, her small hands resting on the leather handbag. She hadn't been confused all these years. She hadn't been deaf to the drama, the stolen rent money, or the whispers in the hallway. She had just been quietly, patiently documenting it. Panic set in, real, primal panic. I watched Gary's pupils dilate. His breathing turned shallow. He reached frantically under his chair, grabbed the brown envelope from the strip mall notary, and violently slapped a stack of cheap printer paper onto the table. I have the transfer documents right here, he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. Trevor, get over here and sign this right now. We're doing this tonight. The papers looked absurd. They didn't have a law firm's thick watermark. They were just typed words and a cheap purple stamp. Trevor, sit down, Rose commanded. Her voice wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. It cut through the cold night air like a razor blade. Trevor, who had half stood up from his chair, immediately collapsed back into his seat as if his legs had been kicked out from under him. Rose stood up. She didn't lean on the heavy wooden table for support. She didn't reach for her cane. She stood tall, her spine perfectly rigid. 84 years of Southern steel. Sit down, Gary, she ordered. Mama, this doesn't concern you, Gary started, pointing a shaking finger at her. I said sit down. Gary fell backward into his heavy oak chair as if he'd been physically shoved by an invisible hand. The 61-year-old bully suddenly looked like a terrified, shrinking schoolboy called to the principal's office. Rose looked down at her handbag. Click. The brass clasp snapped open. The sound echoed across the silent patio like a gunshot. She reached inside and pulled out a faded, yellowed envelope. It looked ancient. 28 years, Rose said, her voice carrying a deep, heavy sorrow. For 28 years I have watched you treat this beautiful girl like she was dirt on your shoe. I promised your father right before he passed that I would wait to expose this until you showed the entire town exactly what kind of monster you are. She slowly turned her pale blue eyes toward Reverend Dawson. He just did. Rose walked 2 steps forward and placed the yellowed envelope in the dead center of the table, right next to the ham I had spent hours glazing. Open it, Gary, Rose said, her tone absolute, or I will ask Reverend Dawson to read it to the entire congregation this Sunday. Gary stared at the envelope as if it were a live grenade. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely grip the thin paper. He tore the edge open, his breathing coming in ragged, shallow gasps. He reached inside and pulled out a piece of lined notebook paper. It was covered in faded blue ink. Read it aloud, Rose demanded. Gary's eyes darted back and forth across the page. I watched his face closely. It morphed from defensive rage to deep confusion and finally to absolute, gut-wrenching terror. All the remaining blood left his face, turning his skin the color of dirty snow. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked exactly like a patient going into sudden cardiac arrest. When he refused to speak, dropping the paper onto the table with trembling fingers, Rose lifted her chin and spoke to the audience herself. That is a letter your wife wrote to a man named Craig Jenkins in 1996, Rose stated cleanly, her voice ringing out in the cold air. She was careless. She used it as a bookmark and left it in a library book she returned to me. It says, and I quote, "He will never find out about Trevor. Gary is so arrogant he thinks the boy is his. I told him Wendy was the affair baby and he bought it. That's all that matters." The bomb went off. It wasn't a loud explosion, it was a sudden, violent vacuum that sucked every ounce of oxygen off the enclosed patio. My brain is trained to calculate medication dosages and timeline traumas in fractions of a second. I did the math instantly. Diane didn't have an affair 34 years ago when I was born. She had the affair 31 years ago. She was pregnant with another man's son. To protect her newborn baby and to keep her comfortable, easy lifestyle with a man she knew was a tyrant, she had to give Gary a scapegoat. So, she pointed her finger at her innocent 3-year-old daughter. She confessed to an affair but changed the timeline, throwing me straight to the wolves so her son could be the untouched golden prince. My own mother watched me starve for affection my entire life just to buy her own peace. My knees suddenly felt like water. I grabbed the back of my wooden chair to keep from collapsing. The cold wood dug into my palms. Gary dropped the notebook paper. It fluttered down, landing right next to the sweet potato casserole. He slowly turned his head to look at Diane. You could almost hear his neck creak. Diane was already backing away from the table, her hands raised defensively in front of her face. She was hyperventilating, her chest heaving under her expensive cashmere sweater. "Gary, please," she choked out. But the real explosion didn't come from Gary. It came from Trevor. Trevor shot to his feet with terrifying speed. He hit the table so hard his water glass tipped over, spilling a cold puddle across the wood. He knocked his heavy oak chair violently off the edge of the patio, sending it crashing into the dead winter grass below. "What?" Trevor screamed. His voice cracked. It was a high, hysterical sound of pure panic. He pointed a trembling, thick finger at Diane. "You lied to me, my whole life. I'm the bastard?" Morgan, who just days ago had been confidently measuring my grandmother's walls for a sage-green nursery, physically recoiled. She shrank away from Trevor, sliding her chair back until it hit the brick wall of the house. She stared at him as if he had suddenly grown a second head or contracted a highly contagious virus. Her guaranteed estate, her free rent, her entire secured future had just evaporated into the freezing December air. "Trevor, please," Diane sobbed, taking a step toward him with her arms outstretched. "I was protecting you. Don't touch me," Trevor roared. He backed away from her, his face a mask of absolute horror and disgust. "You ruined everything. You let him treat Wendy like trash for my whole life, and it was M.E.? It was always M.E. Trevor didn't look at Morgan. He didn't look at Gary, who was still staring blankly at the table. He just turned and bolted. He ran off the porch, his heavy boots pounding a frantic rhythm down the wooden stairs and out into the dark, freezing yard. A moment later, the loud roar of his truck engine shattered the night. Tires tore up the gravel driveway, spitting rocks into the grass as he sped away from the blast zone. Gary was completely catatonic. He stared down at the fraudulent legal documents he had proudly paid a strip mall notary to stamp. He stared at the blue ink on the old library paper. His entire empire, his obedient wife, his golden heir, his stolen house, was suddenly nothing but ashes slipping through his fingers. But Grandma Rose wasn't finished. She reached her frail hand back into the faded envelope. In the hospital, there are old, lingering sicknesses, and then there is the final, clinical cause of death. Rose was about to deliver the time of death. She pulled out a second document. This one wasn't old, lined notebook paper. It was crisp, white, and looked exactly like the official lab reports I filed every day in the ICU. After Howard passed in 2016, Rose said calmly, her voice echoing over the ruined dinner table. I knew what Gary was trying to do, so I ordered a medical DNA kit. I swabbed the inside of my own cheek, and one afternoon, while Trevor was taking a nap on my couch, I plucked a single hair from his head. I mailed them to the lab. Rose dropped the crisp white paper onto the table, right over Gary's fraudulent deed. 0 shared DNA, Rose stated. Her voice was completely empty of pity. Trevor is not my grandson, which means, Gary, he has never been your son. Gary let out a sound I will never ever forget. It wasn't a cry, it wasn't a scream, it was a wet, rattling gasp, like the sound of a patient's lung completely collapsing inward. All the arrogant air violently left his body. He slumped forward in his heavy oak chair, burying his face between his knees. His broad shoulders heaved as he began to aggressively hyperventilate, his fingers digging into his own scalp. He had built a 34-year kingdom on a foundation of cruel lies, and it had just been obliterated by an 84-year-old woman with a $20 DNA test. Reverend Dawson stood up. She didn't offer to pray for him. She didn't reach out a comforting hand. She looked down at Gary's trembling, ruined form with absolute professional disgust. I think, Reverend Dawson said, her voice echoing coldly off the brick walls, this dinner is over. I didn't stay to watch the rest of the fallout. The emergency was over. The bleeding had stopped. I looked down the length of the ruined table at Grandma Rose. She met my eyes through the flickering shadows of the patio heaters. She didn't smile, but she gave me a firm, loving nod. Go. I walked over to Aunt Joyce. I reached out, and Layla practically leaped into my arms. She wrapped her short legs tightly around my waist, burying her face deep into my neck. She smelled perfectly of warm yeast rolls and Joyce's old-fashioned rosewater perfume. It was the smell of safety. I held the back of her head, feeling her rapid heartbeat slowly syncing with my own steady, calm rhythm. I turned to leave, but I stopped right behind Gary's chair. He was still staring at the concrete floor, his breathing ragged and sharp. He was completely ruined. For a fraction of a second, a brief, sharp memory flashed through my mind. I was 10 years old, standing in this exact kitchen, holding a straight A report card. I had waited 2 hours for him to come home, desperate for a single nod of approval. When he finally walked in, he had brushed past me without a word, asking Trevor if he wanted to go throw a baseball. I remembered the heavy, suffocating pain of that moment, the desperate childhood need to be claimed. I looked down at his shaking shoulders, and I felt nothing. The 10-year-old girl was gone. I'm your daughter, Dad, I said. My voice was eerily steady. There were no tears in my eyes, just cold, clinical fact. I always was, but after tonight, I don't ever need you to believe it again. I turned my back on him. I walked off that enclosed porch, through the silent, dark house, and out the front door into the freezing December night. As my boots hit the gravel driveway, the harsh wail of sirens cut through the quiet neighborhood. The screaming, the shattered glass, and Trevor's violent, tire-screeching departure had been too much. Mrs. Marshall's husband, or perhaps someone else on Linden Avenue, had made the call. Red and blue lights suddenly violently swept across the dark, sprawling branches of Grandpa Howard's massive oak tree. A Camden police cruiser pulled sharply up to the curb, tires crunching on the frost. 2 officers stepped out quickly, their hands resting cautiously on their belts. "Ma'am," the older officer called out, shining a harsh maglite across the lawn. The beam hit my face, illuminating the exhaustion and the flour still dusted on my dark coat. We got a call about a severe domestic disturbance, a vehicle fleeing recklessly. Everyone okay inside? In my profession, I give handover reports to the oncoming shift every single morning. I know how to deliver the facts without the emotion. I stopped at the edge of the driveway, adjusting Layla's weight on my hip. A profound, heavy numbness had washed over me. I felt completely detached from the house standing behind me. "There's no physical trauma, officer," I said, my voice flat and hollow. "No weapons, just a family dispute that got loud. My brother left in a hurry, but he's gone. The rest of them are on the back patio." The younger officer stepped closer, shining his light toward the dark porch. "Are you in any danger, ma'am? Do you need us to escort you inside to get your things?" "No," I replied, looking him dead in the eye. "I'm leaving. The instigator is in shock on the patio. The homeowner is an 84-year-old woman. She's safe. It's over." They nodded slowly, sensing the absolute finality in my tone, and jogged up the wooden steps to deal with the ashes Gary had left behind. I strapped Layla into her car seat. I got behind the steering wheel and shut the heavy door, sealing us inside the dark, quiet cabin of my aging sedan. I put the key in the ignition. The engine turned over, the heater blowing cold air against my numb fingers. I gripped the leather steering wheel so hard my knuckles instantly ached. I looked at the rearview mirror. The flashing police lights painted the Thompson house in frantic, chaotic colors. It looked like a crime scene, and in a way it was. 34 years of emotional theft had just been exposed. I shifted into drive and pulled away from the curb. For the first time in my entire life, as I drove into the freezing, empty streets of Camden, I took a full, deep breath. The invisible, crushing weight on my chest was gone. The drive back to our cramped studio apartment was the quietest 15 minutes of my entire life. The adrenaline rush that had carried me through the confrontation slowly bled out of my system, leaving behind a heavy, profound numbness. I gripped the steering wheel, the heater finally blowing warm air against my frozen hands. In the rearview mirror, Layla had already fallen asleep, her head tilted against the window, her small chest rising and falling in a steady, peaceful rhythm. As the streetlights of Camden rhythmically washed over the dark cabin of my car, a sharp, uninvited memory flashed behind my eyes. I was 16. It was pouring rain. I was standing in the kitchen, soaking wet after walking home from my shift at a local diner because Gary refused to pick me up. Trevor had just been handed the keys to a brand new truck in the driveway. I had asked Gary, shivering and dripping onto the linoleum, why Trevor didn't have to get a job. Gary hadn't even looked up from his newspaper. "Thompson blood earns its keep, Wendy. Trevor is building a legacy, you're just paying rent." I let out a slow, breathy laugh that fogged the cold windshield. Thompson blood. The irony was so sharp it physically ached. Trevor was never Thompson blood. The golden child, the protected heir, the boy who had coasted on a lie for 3 decades, was just a ghost haunting a house that belonged to the woman he had tried to evict. The fallout over the next few weeks was entirely apocalyptic. In a small southern town like Camden, 18 witnesses fleeing a Christmas dinner is the equivalent of a front-page newspaper advertisement. The gossip spread with the aggressive speed of a highly contagious virus. By Wednesday, the women under the dryers at the beauty salon knew every detail of the library letter. By Thursday, the men buying lumber at the hardware store were loudly discussing Gary's fraudulent strip mall deed. Gary was a man who had built his entire identity on the rigid, perfect perception of his morality. He lived for the audience, and the audience utterly destroyed him. Reverend Dawson didn't wait for Sunday. She called Gary into her church office that Tuesday morning. When he cowardly refused to show up, she sent a certified, notarized letter directly to Linden Avenue, officially informing him that he was permanently stripped of his position as a church deacon. He was a laughingstock. Diane fled. She packed 3 expensive suitcases and drove to her sister's house in Monroe, terrified of the man she had shackled herself to and the son she had lied to. Trevor completely vanished. He changed his phone number, dropped his part-time mechanic gig, and refused to speak to either of his parents for months. Morgan, realizing the sage green nursery and the free estate were gone, packed her bags and left him 2 days later. As for the fraudulent legal documents Gary had drawn up, they were essentially expensive toilet paper. He owed the terrified strip mall notary nothing, but the humiliation had cost him his entire empire. A month later, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was 8 a.m. I was just walking out of the hospital sliding doors, the crisp January air hitting my tired face. The caller ID flashed. Gary.
My thumb hovered over the screen. A month ago, that name would have spiked my heart rate and flooded my stomach with dread. Now, my pulse didn't even flutter. I was the charge nurse, and I was looking at a discharged patient. I hit accept. Hello. Wendy. His voice was entirely hollow. It was stripped of all its booming arrogance, reduced to a dry, rasping whisper. He sounded like an old, broken man who had finally realized he was sitting alone in the dark. Can we talk? I didn't stop walking toward my car. My boots crunched steadily on the salted pavement. Yes, I said. My voice was cold, clinical, and absolute. But I have rules, Dad. I'm going to list them, and you are going to listen. First, you never speak of that night, or your delusions, in front of Layla ever again. Second, I am no longer paying you a single dime for utilities. If Rose needs money, I hand the cash to her directly. Third, you will get into heavy psychiatric counseling.
A long, heavy, suffocating silence stretched across the cellular line. I could hear him breathing. Shallow, defeated breaths. He was waiting for me to soften. He was waiting for the apology I used to constantly offer. It never came. Do you understand? I demanded, pressing the key down.
I understand, he finally whispered.
I hung up. I didn't say goodbye. It wasn't forgiveness. It was a strict, unbreachable boundary. I slipped the phone into my pocket and unlocked my car. 2 months later, the bitter winter finally broke. I was sitting on the wooden porch swing at the Linden Avenue house. The warm spring breeze carried the scent of blooming jasmine and wet earth. Inside the kitchen, Layla was completely covered in white flour, loudly and terribly singing Twinkle Twinkle Little Star while mashing bananas for bread with Aunt Joyce. Their laughter spilled out through the open screen door. The porch swing creaked as Grandma Rose shuffled out and sat down next to me. She didn't have her cracked leather handbag. For the first time in my life, her hands were empty, resting lightly on her lap. She reached out and patted my knee. Her pale blue eyes caught the afternoon sunlight. The house is legally in an ironclad trust now, Wendy, Rose said softly, her voice carrying the quiet peace of a completed mission. I had a real lawyer do it downtown. It goes directly to you and Layla when I pass. Gary has zero legal claim. He can never, ever touch it. I stopped swinging. I looked at the tiny, fragile woman sitting next to me. She had carried the agonizing burden of the truth in a leather handbag for nearly 3 decades, waiting with terrifying patience just to make sure the timing of the explosion was lethal enough to completely save me. She had orchestrated a masterclass in survival. Thank you, Grandma, I whispered, my throat finally tightening with genuine healing emotion. I stopped paying Gary his $700 extortion fee. I took that money, packed up our drafty studio, and moved Layla and me into a beautiful, sunlit 3-bedroom apartment much closer to the hospital. There were no drafts. There were no dark shadows. Layla picked out the exact paint for her own bedroom walls. Sky blue, very calming. I stopped cooking for people who desperately wanted to watch me starve. I stopped bleeding myself dry to keep a toxic machine running. I don't know what the holidays will look like next year. I don't know if the table will be full, or if it will just be Layla, Joyce, Rose, and me, but I know this one absolute, undeniable truth. My daughter will never, ever sit at a table where a man tells her she doesn't belong. That is my line, and I will burn the entire house down before I let anyone cross it. What an incredible, gut-wrenching journey. Wendy's story is a powerful reminder that sometimes the only way to heal a wound is to finally let it bleed out into the light. It's a testament to the strength of mothers, the wisdom of grandmothers, and the undeniable power of the truth. If Wendy's courage moved you, or if you've ever found your own voice in the middle of a storm, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support allows us to keep sharing these intense, deeply human stories of resilience and justice.